we're at that time when fundamental reinvention has to happen.
ESG is
The buzzword ESG in India hasn't had the kind of polarizing political impact that it has in the US. That India is in a position where it could really step out and become a global leader in leading us toward a more sustainable capitalism.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainability Karma. I'm your host Rajiv Tikoo. Today we have a very special guest with us, Prof Stuart Hart. He is one of the founding fathers of corporate sustainability globally. A Fortune 500 consultant in India, he has worked very closely with the Tatas apart from others. In the section of Sustainability Karma, we talk about the recently released new book, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future and related issues. Welcome, Prof Stuart Hart, to the section of Sustainability Karma.
Delighted to be with you.
What's the highlight of your new book, Beyond Shareholder Primacy?
Yeah. So if I had to try to capsulize, what's really the core message of the book, it might go something like this: that the current version of capitalism, which dominates the world, which I think is an American form, kind of emanating from the 70s and 80s, that I call shareholder capitalism, right, in the book, that really is in some ways an outlier. In other words, I think many people, business people, and especially business students, have come to believe that the way that capitalism is being committed today is the way it's always been committed, right? Is the way it should be committed, is the best way. And I think what I conclude, having now looked back historically over the last 400 or 500 years to understand, sort of the source code and evolution of what we think of as capitalism today, is that the way that capitalism is being committed today is not the way it's always been committed. That capitalism has gone through cycles of excess, of extraction, followed by reform and reinvention. That there have been times, when it's been dominated by what Keynes called the animal spirits. But there are other times when it's been pulled back, and what Lincoln called our better angels, have tended to dominate more. So that it's within our reach, it's within our grasp to fundamentally transform capitalism itself. And I think that's probably the main takeaway from the book. Obviously, the book goes into a fair amount of depth as to how we do that, right? In other words, what can corporate leaders do? What can business leaders do for in terms of their own companies? But then also, what do they need to be thinking about in terms of larger systemic change and institutional redesign?
And how does it build on your previous work?
Yeah. So I think it's kind of in some ways a natural evolution and a natural outgrowth. Because as you know, I've been at this for a while, and wrote a piece actually now going on, it's not quite 30 years, but it was published in Harvard Business Review in 1997. The title of which was Beyond Greening: Strategies for a Sustainable World. And then did work with, of course, C.K. Prahalad. We wrote a piece called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid over 20 years ago now. And then my previous kind of book, the title was Capitalism at the Crossroads. And this work, now, which is 25 plus years old, sort of took the idea beyond greening is that, greening is great, which has to do with the incremental improvement of today's products and processes, things like eco-efficiency and product stewardship and sustainable sourcing and product take back and so forth, and life cycle thinking. All that's great, right? But that's not going to really move the needle when it comes to the global dashboard, either environmentally or socially. And that we needed to get to strategies for what I call beyond greening. And beyond greening was all about disruptive innovation, next generation inherently clean and regenerative technology, creating new markets that lift the underserved at the base of the income pyramid. That was the beyond greening agenda. And we were talking about this 25 plus years ago. The problem is that, while we've made a lot of headway on the greening agenda, we have yet to really tackle the beyond greening agenda. And we've now run out of runway, right? Had we started, 25 years ago in the late 90s on the Beyond Greening agenda, I think we would be in a different place globally now. But we haven't, right? And the conclusion that I draw and why I think the new book is a natural build on my previous work is that it's sort of the rules of the game, right? It's sort of shareholder primacy capitalism that has really slowed the movement into the transformational space. Simply because it requires, sort of longer term thinking, bigger bets, doesn't drop to the bottom line quickly, doesn't drive quarterly earnings growth, which is sort of the code for success according to shareholder capitalism. And the problem is now that we've sort of reached the point of crisis, right? That's produced a climate crisis, that's produced the sixth extinction well underway, and toxic inequality almost everywhere in the world. And there's just no more time to stall, right? So the book Beyond Shareholder Primacy takes the view that the time has come where the individual actions and strategies of companies and leaders aren't going to be nearly enough. That might have been the way to go 25 or 30 years ago. But now we're at a point where it's going to require business leaders themselves to step up to the plate to become agents of system change. Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston's, newish book, Net Positive, also makes this point. And they talk about, kind of business leaders becoming net positive advocates for public policy change and so forth. I totally support that. My book kind of tackles the system change challenge from a slightly different angle. They're complementary. But what I try to do is kind of understand what are the institutions, right? Kind of the root causes, the institutions that support and define capitalism itself. Things like the public equity markets, things like business education, which I see as one of the biggest root causes of our problem, is business schools, right? I say that as someone who's been a business school professor for almost 40 years, so I'm complicit. But and MBA programs in particular, right? That unless or until we're able to kind of change the way business students are taught, and unless we're able to kind of change the rules that drive value creation, in other words, I think of it as redefining the concept of value itself, then it's difficult to see how we emerge from the obvious trap that we're in and the trajectory, which is to oblivion.
You're one of the pioneering thought leaders in corporate sustainability, and this goes back more than 2 decades now. How do you look back and ahead as of now?
Well, I think it's really along the lines of what I've just described. I think we've, as a society, sort of gone through several evolutions over the last, say, 40 years, kind of the time frame within which I've been working on this. And I think the way of thinking about these challenges, like going back to the 70s and 80s, was as a regulatory challenge, sort of an end of pipe cleanup, pollution control, challenge where, government would impose rules on companies for what they could and could not emit, or the problems they could or could not make, kind of workplace rules and so forth, all very important for sure, right? Sort of the kind of the regulatory era, the end of pipe era. But that proved to be somewhat fickle because different political administrations would come in and loosen those rules, and then we would take steps backwards. But then we sort of, I think, in the 80s and into the 90s, realized that it was possible for companies, especially when it came to, what we think of now as scope 1 and 2, sort of the facilities of the organization itself, that when it came to emissions and even some workplace exposure issues in terms of, kind of occupational safety and health, that if you just thought differently as a company in terms of continuous improvement, in terms of quality, in terms of prevention, in terms of what came to be known as eco-efficiency, that, you could actually reduce emissions, reduce exposures, reduce waste, and save money and reduce risk. That was the big eco-efficiency revolution that put sustainable business on the map, back in the late 80s, early 90s. That's what allowed it to first kind of come into business schools, because it suddenly became relevant, right, from the standpoint of business, right? Because now this could be something that could drive efficiency, waste reduction, cost savings, risk reduction, and so forth. But that fairly quickly, it became clear that while that was important, the bigger impact wasn't just the facilities themselves, right? It wasn't just the waste and kind of exposures at company facilities, but rather the supply chains and product systems. How the products themselves impacted society. And so this is where the idea of product stewardship kind of came from, and that I would say is still the dominant perspective, right? Is that we're thinking about the lexicon today is scope 3. That companies need to think about their entire value chain. They need to think about sustainable sourcing and procurement. They need to think about the impact of their products and use downstream, and be accountable for that. Now there's reporting requirements for that in Europe and in India, right? And in India, kind of scope through reporting requirements. And it's taken some time, right? It's taken us probably 20, 25 years to get to that point where this idea of product stewardship is now becoming ingrained, almost becoming required. And the social side increasingly now, has been elevated, not without controversy, right? When we have terminology like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so forth, and now ESG, and I think one of the other things that has characterized this space is the evolution of buzzwords, right? That different buzzwords emerge at different points in time. They're interpreted in different ways. Sometimes they become controversial, but almost always the buzzwords don't last, right? They rise and then they recede to the background, and there are new buzzwords, but for me, the important thing is to understand the thread through time, right? Kind of the underlying kind of challenges and content are what's important, not the buzzwords used to describe them. So I think we've now arrived at the time where, as I said before, the beyond greening agenda really comes home to roost. I think it's becoming increasingly clear to everyone that we're at that time when fundamental reinvention has to happen. And it has to happen at the level of kind of individual companies, technologies, kind of industry shifts, right, to inherently clean and regenerative technologies, whether it's energy or mobility or food and agriculture or materials or whatever industry it is you choose to look at. Those are the challenges before those companies and industries now. And also how we come to grips with how we tackle kind of global inequality. I think those are the clear agendas that are on the table, and that the dominant form of capitalism, which came out of America in the 70s and 80s, has just simply not been up to the challenge, right? So that, hence my new book, right? Which that's the challenge that I try to take on. I think that's what we currently face. That's how these issues have evolved, and that's where we stand today.
Do you think ESG is also a buzzword?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All the earmarks of a buzzword, because it, of course, first emerged from the investment community, right? It was a fairly narrow buzzword, right? That stood for, on the kind of investment side, that looking at investments through the lens of ESG meant that you could assess risk, right, for current shareholders, exposure to climate risk, right, exposure to other risks having to do with environment and kind of social risks. And it was a risk mitigation tool, right? It was a way of evaluating companies in terms of how well they're buffered from those external risks. And it was all about protecting shareholders. And that's really what the whole first generation of ESG investing was about, and ESG ratings and so forth. That's the simple truth, right? That still is the current reality. But somehow the term ESG mushroomed, right, and turned into a much bigger idea, and sort of came to stand in for the term sustainability itself, right? It kind of and then it kind of was seized upon by the right as this sort of conspiracy to try to take things down, which I think just is wholly ridiculous. And has become sort of a culture war tool, at least in America, right? I think I don't see that so much in the rest of the world, and I don't think that's been the case in India. We can talk about that in a moment. But that's clearly the case here in the US, that the term ESG and DEI have become political footballs, have become part of a culture war. And when that happens, it's time to abandon ship on those buzzwords. The problems, the challenges haven't gone away.
Right.
And so I think becoming consumed in arguments and culture wars over terminology is a dead end.
So what do you think of the future of ESG, given the criticism it has been attracting of late in the US particularly?
Well, I think the term is fraught, right? And so for me personally, I just now, when I speak to groups or, have a corporate audience, I start off by saying I have no interest whatsoever in engaging, in a debate, a culture war debate about, DEI or ESG. That's not who I am. That's not what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm interested in are the real environmental and social challenges that we actually face, right? As companies, as countries, and as societies, and as the world, there are real challenges that we can't just wave away, right? They exist, they're real, and it's up to us to figure out how to address them. Mm-hmm. And I think that business can play a transformative role in all that. As a strategy professor, right? I've taught business and corporate strategy for 40 years. Mm-hmm. I see a huge opportunity for corporations and for business leaders to take the bull by the horns on this in ways that are not only good for the world, but really good for those companies too, that can drive long-term value creation.
What's your experience about corporate India's intended action on sustainability in the global context today?
Yeah. So as you and I were discussing earlier, I've had a long-standing kind of interest and, in some fairly deep experience in India over the years, including trying to kind of start up an institute in India now back 10, 12 years ago. Well, it's probably 12, 13, 14 years ago now. That was focused on sustainable entrepreneurship and sustainable innovation. And learned a lot in that process. There were goods and bads. Ultimately, that institute was not able to kind of sustain itself, but we learned an awful lot in the process. And the conclusion that I come to now, because I'm now again spending a bit more time in India, reconnected with, I left Michigan a while back, and I was at UNC and then at Cornell, and then involved in starting up this new MBA program at the University of Vermont, called the Sustainable Innovation MBA. But I'm now back, I'm retired. So that gives me the license to sort of do gigs where I think I can learn something, where I think I can have impact. So I'm re-engaged at the Ross School at Michigan and have gotten back involved in executive education again. And that some of that is happening in India. So the perspective that I've kind of come to now from, having now spent a little more time in India again, is that timing is everything, right? That I think that our work trying to create this institute, back around 2011, 2012, it was just maybe a little bit ahead of its time, right? That the Indian corporate world was just not ready for it, right? That I think the large, sort of legacy corporates like the Tatas and the Birlas and so forth, that they were there, right, at that point in time. But not, mainstream corporate India. I think that's changed. And the way I see it now is that, India, because I used to teach an executive sustainable business program with the Confederation of Indian Industries now 20 years ago, right? We were doing a program. And, I think then, like 20 years ago, these issues were being bandied about, but, they were mostly sort of seen through the environmental lens, and most Indian business leaders saw that as something they could assign to environmental engineers to deal with. So that it sort of got thrown over the wall to environmental engineers to deal with, deal with emissions and pollution. And then with the passage of the corporate CSR law, now back 12 years ago or so, and that's when we were trying to create this new institute. While, there are some really good things that have come of that, I think, all initiatives have positive impacts, but also have unintended consequences, some of which aren't good. I think when it comes to the CSR law, for many Indian corporate leaders, that simply meant throwing 2% over the wall, right, to an NGO. and then you can just sort of wash your hands of it and not really have to think about it anymore. You gave your money, and you're done, right? So that it didn't really have the effect of changing the way Indian business leaders thought, because they could just throw it over the wall. Now, my reading is that the kind of the emergence of ESG in India has had a different impact, right? It hasn't had the kind of polarizing political impact that it has in the U.S. Rather, it strikes me that it's really gotten Indian business leaders' attention because it's coming from the investment side. And that means that kind of the business leaders, the corporate leader, the Indian corporates now, I think, it's gotten their attention along with Scope 3 reporting, right? That's different than anything that came down the pike before. And so I sense that India is at, sort of a really important kind of decisive moment in its history. And I sense that India is in a position where it could really step out and become a global leader in leading us toward a more sustainable capitalism. Because, of it, the true Indian business and industry perspective, philosophy, culture, it is the Tatas, right, and the Birlas, and that DNA, is all about the role of business in building communities and serving stakeholders. That is, in my view, that's the DNA of India, of true Indian industry. And if India can kind of reach back and tap back into that, I think there's a real chance that India can emerge as a leader, of helping us create a truly sustainable form of capitalism. Now, I say that because there's a cross current, which is, that as India has stepped out in the world, right, kind of little spring in the step, China maybe has taken a step back. There's now Modi sort of, we can be number 3, and there's a positive aspect to that, right? That I won't go into the political side of that, but I think there's a positive aspect economically. But what comes along with that, I think, is a growing attraction to the American style of capitalism. In other words, it strikes me that India is in some ways where America was like back in the 80s. Entrepreneurs want to go public. They want to get rich quick, that they do the IPO, get cashed out, that it's all about shareholder value, that, that some of the corporates are, sort of look like GE, in the 90s, that it's about M&A, it's about driving short-term share price. If India goes down that path and repeats the mistakes of America in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and goes down the shareholder primacy pathway, it could be disastrous for not only India, but the world. So I think India is at a really decisive point in history where, which direction it goes, I think will make all the difference in the world. But I'm excited about the possibilities.
What's your gut feeling? How is India going forward?
Well, I'm an optimist. So I'm putting my chips on, on India moving aggressively toward the transformational path. Because of the nature of the challenges that that a country like India faces. Right? I mean, they're just, which I think is the difference that India has long kind of faced. Right, the challenges of rural poverty and inequality, swelling urban slums and shanty towns. So, I think the ideas around DEI get interpreted differently in an Indian context than they do in America, where, the admission that America has a poverty problem or an inequality problem has been more difficult for Americans to swallow, right? At least some Americans. And there's a racial tinge to it, which I think has become really counterproductive. That we as a country, it's our unique challenge that we have to figure out. But I don't think India thinks about these things, has a different history, and so the kind of the interpretation of things like equity, inclusion, inequality are just seen differently in India. So I think there's a real opportunity. And this is certainly what I'm working for, is, to bring on these more transformational strategies, these beyond greening strategies, the creation of guardrails and policies around the institutions of capitalism, such that you're rewarded as a company for actually solving these problems.
It would be interesting to hear a couple of examples of your engagement with corporate India on these issues.
Well, I mean, so working with individual companies, right, and also doing executive education programs, and I would hope to do more and more of that kind of work in the years ahead, right? So, we have this program now that we're doing with the Economic Times of India. My
Right.
good friend and colleague Vipul Arora. Uh, we'll working through Ross, also working with some of like the Tatas and some of the larger established legacy corporates in India, which I think are really important culture bearers. But then also working with the, sort of what we would think of in America as the family business sector. And and again, in America, family business has a different connotation than it does in India, where still probably many, if not most, of the Indian corporates, sort of the mid-size Indian corporates, most are still family owned and operated, or at least many. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a real opportunity to bring kind of succession thinking, right? Because there's a desire for longevity, a desire for succession, which I think is different than just kind of let's get this IPO up and get cashed out and move on from there.
What has been your experience of working with the Tatas and the Birlas particularly?
Well, again, that goes back over 20 plus years, and was able to kind of develop a bit of a relationship with Ratan Tata. I was at Cornell for 10 years, right? And Ratan Tata is a Cornell guy, so that was how that was how that happened. And then he also kind of graciously agreed to come into a few offerings of the program that we offered with the Confederation of Indian Industries, going back to like 2005, 6, 7, 8, in that time frame. And obviously the Tatas and the Birlas, they're huge, sprawling conglomerates, right? So that it's difficult to make any general statement. Each one of the businesses has its own kind of is a kind of a tub on its own bottom, has its own personality. But to me, what's important is the kind of the corporate legacy that infuses a sense of values into all of those businesses, right? So to me, for the Tatas, the important thing is, its founding kind of spirit, right? Going back to, Jamsetji Tata and so forth. But then in more recent years, it's corporate governance where, the Tata companies basically are majority owned, or at least controlling interest owned, by the trusts. So from a corporate governance point of view, to me, that's a really important signal for the world. I mean, that I think is a model actually for the world to look at, right? That there are a few other companies that have taken steps like that. But that is, from a structural point of view, presents really interesting ways to think about how for-profit companies can be guided by a larger purpose.
Thank you, Professor Stuart Hart. It has been wonderful talking to you and getting a sense of how things are shaping up globally and in India also.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about it.
We hope you like this program. This program is also live streamed on All India Radio and aired on community radio stations. We look forward to your feedback on our WhatsApp number 9818120554. For participation in this program, write to us at sustainability.karma@gmail.com. You may also connect with us on social media. This podcast is also available on podcast hosting sites. Looking forward to meet you again at the same time next week with a new episode and a new guest. Till then, goodbye from all of us. Sustainability Karma, a podcast series with senior journalist and editor Rajiv Tikoo on sustainable development, sustainability and ESG.